It was a chilly Wednesday afternoon, and the memory is still fresh in my mind. For several weeks, I had been dealing with a troublesome leak in my kitchen sink. What began as a minor drip had quickly escalated into a more significant problem. Unsure of what else to do, I finally decided to call a plumber for assistance. His name was Alex. Although I hadn't met him before, I had heard good things about his work, so I anticipated a quick resolution. When he arrived, I opened the door and was taken aback. He looked much younger than I expected, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, and he was quite attractive with a tall, sturdy frame and broad shoulders. I greeted him warmly and guided him to the kitchen where the leak was. I must admit, I had put on a nice robe that morning. It wasn't revealing, just something light and comfortable. However, when I noticed the way Alex briefly glanced at me, a little spark ignited as he started working beneath the sink. I found myself standing close by, simply observing him. I couldn't explain why, but there was something captivating about him. Perhaps it was his confident demeanor, or maybe it was just that I hadn't had company in ages. Whatever it was, I felt a stirring inside me. I started chatting with him, asking about his day, how long he had been a plumber, and other light topics. He was polite, responding without looking up too much, though I could sense a hint of nervousness in his voice, as if he was trying to concentrate on the task at hand and not on me. It was endearing, really, and I couldn't help but smile. At one point, I reached out and lightly squeezed his shoulder. It was an innocent gesture, yet I felt him tense up beneath my touch. "You're quite strong," I complimented, aware that he might be feeling slightly uncomfortable. He looked at me, a bit taken aback, but I offered him a soft smile. He shifted slightly, as if to create distance, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. I stepped a bit closer, feigning interest in the plumbing work he was doing. "Need any assistance?" I asked, fully aware that he didn't. I adjusted my robe slightly, allowing it to slip off my shoulder a bit. Alex didn't respond verbally, but I could see his face redden as he focused intently on the pipes. Leaning down next to him, my hand brushed against his arm. He tensed again, but I didn't pull away. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could tell he felt it too. I stood up slowly, inching even closer to him. He remained crouched under the sink, doing his best to ignore the palpable energy between us. But I was determined not to let it go unnoticed. I waited until he stood up to gather his tools, and that was my cue to make a move. I leaned in close enough for him to feel my breath against his neck. "Is there anything else you could help me with?" I asked, my voice soft but with an edge of flirtation. He looked at me, his eyes wide, momentarily speechless. It was clear he was trying to figure out how to respond, so I gave him a gentle nudge. I let my hand glide down his arm, providing just enough contact to make sure he understood my intentions. Without waiting for a reply, I leaned in and pressed a light kiss on his cheek. It wasn't a bold move, at least not at first, just a soft, tender kiss. Yet I felt him freeze, and I realized I had crossed a boundary. He jumped back, almost colliding with the cabinets, and I could see the panic in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the sink," he stuttered, his voice trembling. I couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I teased, stepping closer once more, my lips mere inches from his. I watched him struggle with his next move, torn between staying and fleeing. His hands shook as he hurriedly packed his tools. "There's something else you could help me with," I whispered, leaning in as if I were about to kiss him again. But just before I could, he stepped back, raising his hands as if to keep me at bay. "Can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted a little, feeling a hint of disappointment, but I knew he wouldn't give in easily. He was flustered, hastily packing his belongings, and I watched him leave, a thrill coursing through me from the entire encounter. I hadn't expected him to react that way, but it was exhilarating to tease him. Perhaps next time, who knows? I let him leave that day, but there was something about his departure. It wasn't just the awkwardness. There was a tension lingering in the air. I realized that while Alex had said no, it wasn't due to a lack of interest. It felt as though he was restraining himself, caught between doing the right thing and giving in to temptation. I could see it in his eyes, the way he hesitated before he left. It was as if he wanted to stay but didn't trust himself to navigate the situation. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the memory of that day. Every time I walked by the sink, I recalled how flustered he had been when I touched his arm, and how his breathing had changed when I kissed his cheek. It was thrilling. It had been a long time since I felt that kind of excitement with anyone, especially someone younger. Honestly, I didn't think I would see him again. I assumed he had resolved not to return after what had transpired. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, it was Alex. "Hey, this is Alex, the plumber. I just wanted to check in and see if everything is okay with the sink. Did the repair hold up?" His tone was polite and professional, yet I could detect a slight tremor beneath his words. A smile spread across my face. "Oh, Alex, how thoughtful of you to call," I said, aiming for a casual tone, though I knew where this could lead. "Funny you should mention it. The sink is fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom I was hoping you could check out. It's probably nothing serious, but I wouldn't feel right without a professional taking a look." There was a brief silence on the other end of the call. I could hear him considering his options, debating whether to return. "I can be there in about an hour," he finally replied. After hanging up, I felt a rush of excitement coursing through me. This time, I was determined not to let him off the hook so easily. I was sure he felt the chemistry between us, even if he tried to downplay it, and I was ready to push things a little further. When Alex arrived, he appeared noticeably more anxious than during his first visit. Although his usual confidence remained, I sensed a hesitance as he stepped into the bathroom. He asked, glancing around as if trying to divert his attention from me. I led him upstairs, and sure enough, there was a minor issue with the faucet. It wasn't leaking, but the handle had loosened. He knelt down to inspect it, this time entirely focused on the task at hand, yet I could tell he was acutely aware of my presence. I stood just behind him, observing his every move without saying a word initially. The silence between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Eventually, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Alex," I said softly, "I've been thinking about you." He paused for a moment, gripping the faucet a bit tighter. "You have," he replied cautiously, as if unsure whether to acknowledge our previous encounter. "I can't stop thinking about what happened last time," I continued, stepping a little closer. "You seemed intrigued but held back. What was stopping you?" He hesitated before answering, and I noticed his knuckles whiten as he worked. "It's just, I'm a professional," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "It wouldn't be right, would it?" I pressed, moving so close that I could practically feel his warmth radiating off him. "Who decides what's right or wrong? Alex, we're both adults here. There's definitely something between us. You can sense it, can't you?" I watched him closely, waiting for his response. I could see his breathing quicken, and his hands trembled slightly as he tightened the handle on the faucet. He stood up and turned to face me, and I noticed the internal struggle in his eyes. He was trying hard to maintain his professionalism and distance, but it was clear he was conflicted. "You don't have to resist," I whispered, stepping even closer, my hand grazing his chest lightly. I could feel his heart racing beneath my fingertips. "No one has to know. It's just the two of us here." He looked down at me, his jaw tense, and for a moment, I thought he might actually back away again. But then, unexpectedly, he reached out, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward him. It wasn't harsh, but it was firm, and I was caught off guard by the suddenness of it. His face was mere inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and intense. "This isn't a game." "I never claimed it was," I replied, smiling. I could feel the electric tension between us. "But it doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes you just need to let go." He hesitated for just a heartbeat longer. But then, without another word, he leaned down and kissed me. This wasn't the tentative peck on the cheek from before. It was something entirely different. This kiss was deep and passionate, as if all the restraint he'd been holding back had finally shattered. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. For a few blissful moments, the outside world faded away. All that existed was Alex, with his hands gripping my waist, his lips on mine, and the intense heat that had been building between us. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, and I could see in his eyes that there was no turning back now. "So what now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I smiled and stepped back just enough to give him some room, but not too far. "I think you know the answer, Alex. We've already crossed that line. Why stop here?" He didn't respond, nor did he need to. With one last glance at the door, he reached for me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. We were both fully committed, and there was no turning back. Let me tell you, the rest of that afternoon was quite an experience. The bathroom wasn't the only thing that got fixed that day. It was a moment I hadn't felt in ages. As soon as Alex kissed me, all the tension and unexpressed desire between us erupted into something we couldn't contain. He drew me closer, his hands exploring my back as his lips pressed against mine. More assured, more intense. I could feel the weight of everything he had held inside. We didn't even make it out of the bathroom initially. He gently pressed me against the wall, his hands exploring my shoulders, waist, and hips. His touch was firm yet respectful, as if he was surrendering control without wanting to overstep any boundaries. But I didn't mind at all. I wanted him to unleash his inhibitions. I craved this just as much as he did. His lips moved from mine to my neck, and I couldn't help but let out a soft gasp. He paused, as if checking in to see if I was comfortable with everything happening. When I didn't stop him, he resumed, his kisses becoming increasingly urgent and needy. It felt as if all the time he had spent resisting this moment had accumulated into something we could no longer ignore. However, we eventually had to pause, if only to catch our breath. We stood there, bodies pressed together, both panting as if we had just completed a marathon. His forehead rested against mine, and for a moment, we were silent, absorbing what had just transpired. "I've never done anything like this," Alex murmured, his voice low and husky. "I shouldn't have." I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart race beneath his shirt. "There's nothing wrong with letting go sometimes, Alex. We're adults, we can do what we want." I smiled gently, trying to ease the guilt I noticed creeping into his expression. He chuckled, but it was a nervous laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," I insisted, stepping back just a little while keeping my hand on him. "You've been holding back." "Why?" I continued. "Because of some invisible line separating right from wrong. Sometimes you just have to follow what feels good." He remained quiet for a moment, gazing at me with an intense, unreadable look. Finally, he exhaled deeply, as if releasing all the tension he had been holding. I guess I needed to hear that. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Once we had both calmed down, I led him downstairs, and we settled in the living room, talking in a way that felt different from before. Our conversation flowed easily, free of the awkwardness I had feared. Instead, we shared laughter and stories, getting to know each other better. Alex told me about his life, how he had spent nearly 10 years as a plumber after leaving a corporate job he despised. He explained how the routine of fixing things had become a comforting aspect of his life, something he could control. It made sense. He seemed like someone who thrived on structure and stability. I shared my own story too, about my marriage and how it ended years ago, leaving me alone but not bitter. I wasn't the type of woman to dwell on regrets. I had enjoyed a fulfilling life, but for a long time, I had been missing something: companionship and passion. I wasn't seeking anything serious, but I longed to feel alive again. And Alex had ignited that spark within me, even if just for an afternoon. As the sun began to set, I realized he had been here much longer than he intended. "You should probably get going," I said, even though a part of me wanted him to stay. He hesitated, appearing reluctant to leave. "Yeah, I guess I should, but I don't want this to end on an awkward note. I don't want you to think I was just, you know." I shook my head, smiling at him. "I don't think that. You're a good man, Alex. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I'm not expecting anything more than what we shared." He looked relieved, though I could still see a hint of confusion in his eyes, as if he wasn't accustomed to such straightforwardness. So, you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything? I laughed softly.
No, Alex. No weird feelings.
It was just one of those moments, no strings, no pressure. He nodded slowly, as if trying to grasp the simplicity of it all. Okay, he said after a long pause. I guess I'll see you around. Maybe, I replied, teasing him a little. If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first person I call. That brought a smile to his face, and he stood up, grabbing his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned back to me one last time. Margaret, I don't regret it. I want you to know that I don't either, I replied softly, watching as he opened the door. Just like that, he was gone. I sat there for a while after he left, reflecting on what had just happened. It was one of those rare moments in life where everything fell perfectly into place. No guilt, no shame, just two people shedding their inhibitions for a little while. In the days that followed, I thought of him occasionally, wondering if he thought of me too. But I didn't reach out. I didn't feel the need to. That afternoon had been precisely what it was meant to be. A moment of escape, a reminder that I was still very much alive and capable of feeling excitement, desire, and spontaneity. As for Alex, I hoped he left feeling the same. Sometimes, it just takes one unexpected connection to make you realize that life doesn't have to be lived within the confines of societal norms. Maybe he returned to his routine, fixing pipes and navigating his days as he always had. Or perhaps that afternoon provided him with a fresh perspective. A new way to embrace spontaneity when the moment felt right. Whatever the case, I wouldn't forget him. And who knows? The next time something in this house breaks, I might just call him. Or perhaps I'll let fate decide. For now, I'll treasure that little adventure for what it was. Something unexpected, something beautiful, and a reminder that even at 64, life is still brimming with surprises.